I want to formally welcome Professor Judith A. Byfield, originally from Jamaica, who is a professor in the Department of History at Cornell University. She specializes mostly on African and Caribbean history with sub-interest in a lot of very interesting things related to feminist studies and Africana studies. She received her BA from Dartmouth College and her PhD from Columbia University. She is the author of amazing work that I absolutely love, including The Great Upheaval, Women and Nation in Post-War Nigeria, just came out with Ohio University Press in 2020, and The Bluest Hands, A Social and Economic History of Women, Indigo Dyers in Western Nigeria. She has co-edited several books, including Global Africa, Africa and World War II, and Gendering the African Diaspora. Byfield has received several national fellowships, including the Fulbright Global Scholar, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the National Humanities Endowment Fellowship, and the Fulbright Senior Scholar Fellowship. Beyond her amazing works, Byfield contributes to the field through service on numerous editorial and advisory boards. She has served on the editorial board for Cambridge University Press for their series New Perspective in African History, and Indiana University Press for their series in Blacks in the Diaspora series. Byfield has served in numerous organizational roles as well. She was co-chair of the program committee for the 17th Berkshire Conference on the History of Women, Gender, and Sexualities in 2017, former president of the African Studies Association in 2011, as well as chair of the Association of African Studies Programs from 2002 and 2005. Today, Judith Byfield will be giving a talk based on her new research project, and I'm sure everyone like me is really excited to learn more. Let us give her a warm welcome. But before we go on, I wanted to share if everyone wanted to feel free to send any questions you may have in the Q&A box, which can usually be found in the bottom right corner of your screen. All right, Judy, you are now the center of focus.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And we've actually been discussing this for quite a while. It was supposed to happen in the spring, but then because of COVID, well, everything changed. It's one of these moments where I said, yes, I will do this. And then I thought, oh my gosh. This talk really is the first presentation I've done on this new project that I began in 2018 with the support of the Fulbright Global Scholar Fellowship. And the project is called Curry, Goat and Gari, West Indian Women in 20th Century Lagosian Society. I also have to thank my intrepid research assistant, Joseph Ayodokun, who conducted archival work in Nigeria and then traveled with me for 3 months up and down Lagos, Ibadan, and parts of Ogun State I had never visited before. So the project is still forming in my mind, and I won't present any conclusions today. Instead, I will share several ideas and insights that are still forming. I would like to begin with a quote that I keep coming back to. It is from an article published by the historian Mary Chamberlain in 2009. Quote, "It is surprising that the Caribbean does not figure more prominently in the new literatures of diaspora, in particular of the African diaspora. The Caribbean's long migratory history, not only to, but from the region, should place it in the vanguard of the African diaspora and diasporic ways of thinking. African peoples may have been dispersed to the Caribbean, but West Indians migrated from it as soon as they could, taking with them distinctive Creole ways of philosophizing and behaving." It was Caribbean migrant workers, men and women, who established complex transnational networks of families, which became critical to the Caribbean and its members living in foreign, and which could herald new understandings of contemporary global families. I revisit this quote in part because I am intrigued by the idea of global families. I envision this project as a way to develop an understanding of the contemporary global family. Global families disrupts the binaries that undergird the discourse on migration. As Chamberlain notes, it is still commonplace to talk about migrant diasporic lives in terms of disruptions and dislocations, discontinuities and disconnections. Migrants threaten the fragile frontiers in which a sense of nationhood is contained and maintained. Migrants internationalize the nation state. So what will contemporary global families tell us about the evolution of capitalism? The evolution of identity formation within national borders, but also across multiple national borders. How does membership in global families help us to navigate the latticework of inequalities constructed by race, class, gender, sexuality, and national origin? And how do the material realities of global families challenge the mythologies we construct about migration and globalization? So today, I will start by giving you a little background about how this project came into being and what I've learned from these initial forays into the archives and the interviews I did in Nigeria. And I've framed this part around inputs. So the first input into this project comes from Jamaica. I am from one of those global Jamaican families. Both sides of my family came from rural areas in Jamaica. My mother's family came from an agricultural community in Trelawney, which is here on the northwest side of the island. And my father came from a fishing village, actually, in Nato Bay, here in St. Mary. In the 1920s, my grandfather worked in Cuba, and his first wife settled in Panama before heading to the US. In the 1940s, my father's siblings were migrating to Kingston, as were my mother's aunts. The 1950s, both my parents migrated to Kingston, while those who had been in Kingston started going to England as part of that post-war wave of migrants. That group included two of my father's sisters and two of my mother's aunts and her children, with whom my mother had lived when she moved to Kingston. The 1960s, my siblings and I, along with my parents, were part of the post-1965 migration to the US. While my mother's cousin June, who had moved to England, married a lawyer from the Gambia and relocated to the Gambia with him. So I grew up all along from the time I lived in Jamaica, knowing that I had cousins in the UK and cousins in the Gambia. Our mothers exchanged letters and photographs. Input 2, grad school. One of my intellectual heroes is Walter Rodney, and he did 2 books on African history before he wrote his history of the Guyanese working people. I worked on a study on deindustrialization in New York for the Institute on Gender at Columbia one summer. Out of that research, my Caribbean project crystallized. It was going to be called New Where, New Country, Migration, Textile Production, and the Jamaican Diaspora in New York City. In an unsuccessful grant proposal I wrote, This research project focuses on Jamaican textile workers who migrated to New York City after 1965. It examines the oppositional flow of labor and capital in this period as American textile manufacturers established roots in Jamaica to take advantage of lower wages, and Jamaican workers welcomed the change in US immigration policy that made it possible for them to contemplate realizing their social and economic aspirations in the US. In the proposal, I also noted that it was ironic that I planned to write on Jamaican migrants. For when one of my professors in grad school, Hollis Lynch, suggests,
Judy,
yes.
sorry to interrupt, but do you have a PowerPoint slide, that the one you wanted us to show?
Oh, no, I'm moving it slowly.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So I was saying that Hollis Lynch had suggested that I write on Jamaican migrants in Nigeria. And I actually had dismissed the idea with some disdain, for I thought, I'm not going to go to Nigeria to write about Jamaicans. Input 3. A cousin by marriage, Lorraine, lived in Nigeria. My great aunt, who had settled in New Jersey, was married to Lorraine's uncle. And when I was going to Nigeria in 1988, my aunt wrote to Lorraine and told her to look out for me. So when I needed a break from the research, I would find my way to Dopemu to hang out with Lorraine and her family. Those weekends with Lorraine were a blast, and I often brought friends with me. We would leave for Lagos on Friday and go to the jazz club run by Fran Kuboye and her husband on Victoria Island. If Lorraine showed up, we would go home with her. If she didn't show up, we would sleep on the floor in Fran's house and then take a taxi to Dopemu the next morning. At Lorraine, I indulged in those Jamaican foods I missed: curry goat, rice and peas, and ginger beer. I attended a Niger Wives Conference, and this is an organization for foreign-born wives of Nigerian men. I went to the West Indian Day Carnival, where they crowned a carnival king and queen. I also went to a wedding where she and her friends from the West Indian Association did an ashoebi, where everyone dressed in the same cloth. She also introduced me to Fran's mother, Dulopo Ransom Kuti, who generously allowed me to interview her several times for my initial dissertation project, the Women's Tax Revolt, led by her mother, Fumileo. Input 4, teaching. I taught several courses in both African and Caribbean history. I also taught seminars on nationalism and decolonization in Africa and marriage and divorce in the African context. As I started to see the end of my current project, The Great Upheaval, it freed my mind to start connecting those dots. I revisited 1988 and my time with Lorraine and the other West Indian women. I was teaching my marriage seminar, and I mentioned to one of my graduate students that I was torn between two projects: the one on the Jamaican textile workers in New York, and one that was developing more so on West Indian women in Lagos. And since I was supervising an independent study project that she was doing on Lagos, she encouraged me to work on Lagos. That closed the circle for me. So I broke the project up into different research phases. So while I was still in the States teaching, I had Joseph, my research assistant, scouring the National Archives in Ibadan, looking for information about West Indians in Lagos, or Nigeria more broadly. Then in 2018, I spent 6 weeks in London at the National Archives looking for documents about marriage among Nigerians in the UK, documents about the Caribbean migration to the UK as well. I spent quite a bit of time reading through the files about those West Indians who came to help rebuild the British colony and yet encountered discrimination and racism. And then in 2019, I spent 3 months in Nigeria, primarily doing interviews. The owner of Jamski, this is where the restaurant is, he introduced me to Megan. An American friend in Ibadan introduced me to a British friend who introduced me to a West Indian friend. I attended meetings of the West Indian Association in Lagos and the Niger Wives branches in Lagos and Ibadan. Some wonderful people I met by chance at the Lagos Studies Association meeting recounted the friends whose mothers were West Indian and called them up for me. So I just kept meeting people all along the way who tried to connect me to West Indians that they knew about. So what were the lessons revealed from all this work? First, there were multiple waves of West Indians to Nigeria. Rina Okonkwo notes that by the middle of the 19th century, West Indians began settling in Lagos, and observers estimated that there were about 68 West Indians in Lagos by 1872. Some came as soldiers with the West India Regiment, but the regiment was actually withdrawn by 1873. Others arrived as missionaries, such as Reverend Edward Richard Ricketts, a Baptist missionary from Jamaica who came to Nigeria in 1895 with his wife and 7 children. Of the 19th century migrants, the most famous is Robert Campbell, who participated in the Niger Valley Exploration Party with Martin Delany in 1859, when they also visited Abeokuta and wrote about it. He returned to Nigeria in 1862 with his wife and 4 children and settled in Lagos, where he started one of the first Nigerian newspapers, the Anglo-African. In the early 20th century, a number of West Indian men came to work on the railway. They, in fact, had been working in some instances on the railway in the Caribbean, and it's because of the knowledge that they had about railways that the colonial government brought them over to work on the Nigerian railway system. Many lived in Ebute Metta, and some requested permission to bring their wives over. One of the most important West Indians in this early 20th century period was Amos Winter Shackelford, whose first wife was actually one of Reverend Ricketts' daughters, Catherine. Shackelford arrived to work on the railway in 1913, but after leaving the railway, he decided to remain in Lagos and to go into business, and he was a builder. Okonkwo suggests I'm sorry about that. Shackelford was a baker. That was business he went into. Okonkwo suggests that he was probably guided by John Ambleston, who was born in Antigua, traveled to Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast before settling in Lagos in 1898. He worked as a mechanic for the Public Works Department before establishing his own business in 1918 as a builder. Now, Shackelford stands out because he became a successful baker, in fact, was known as the bread king of Lagos, and is credited with innovations in bread production in Nigeria. But he also became deeply involved in Nigerian politics. He was president of the UNIA chapter in Lagos, and this is the Garvey organization. He helped found the Nigerian National Democratic Party, the country's first political party, and served as its vice president and then later as president when Herbert Macaulay, the president of the NNDP and the father of Nigerian nationalism, died in 1946. Shackelford's second wife, Gwendolyn, was very active in women's political organizations in Lagos and in the relief effort to support Ethiopia in 1935. And in fact, I first came across information about Gwendolyn Shackelford because she organized a meeting around Ethiopia for women's groups in Abeokuta in 1935. So I actually talk a bit about that in The Great Upheaval. Both Shackelfords were also members of the West Indian Association. Now, in spite of their deep political engagement, Okonkwo argues that many of the West Indians who belonged to the association in this period did not adopt African dress or speak African languages. And so they very much maintained certainly customs and cultural beginnings or cultural styles from the Caribbean, though they became an important part of the intelligentsia in Lagos in this early period. West Indian women also ventured to Nigeria, though in much smaller numbers. There were professional opportunities that enticed a few single professional women to settle in Lagos. There was Jamaican-born Dahlia Whitbourne, who joined her family in Lagos after completing her medical training at the University of London, and she practiced in Lagos from 1928 to 1930. Her father, mother, and two brothers lived in Lagos while her father worked as a produce buyer and overseer for Lagos stores. Henrietta Millicent Douglas, a Grenadian-born journalist, worked for the Lagos-based newspapers, including the West African Pilot, from 1939 to 1955. In the second half of the 20th century, many more West Indian women moved to Nigeria. However, there were significant differences between the West Indian women of the colonial era and those who would arrive particularly after independence. Rather than accompanying West Indian men to Nigeria, increasing numbers of these women were accompanying their Nigerian husbands to Nigeria. And it is this group of Jamaican women or West Indian women I am most interested in. In fact, I have tentatively dubbed or called this group the independence generation. I had assumed that most of the women met their husbands in the UK. However, I was corrected during my very first interview with Megan, who actually met her husband in Canada. Post-war migration was really within the Commonwealth, not just directly to the UK. Some left to join parents who had settled in London before them, but education appears to have been the major reason that most left the Caribbean. Their journeys were indicative of the limited prospects for better education and professional advancement in the region. While abroad, they often met their husbands through social activities. They met them at school, at parties, or at church. Many of the women talked about the intense socializing that happened between young men and women from Africa and the Caribbean. They suggested that many of the African men liked the West Indian food. They liked dancing, they liked the music, and so they never failed to take advantage of an opportunity to gather. Many were also at a point in their lives where they were contemplating marriage. Equally important, they were open to the idea of marrying African men, but more generally, men outside of the Caribbean. I had assumed that openness would have come from an early cultivated interest in African culture or African politics, since decolonialization was quickly unfolding in the 50s and the 60s. But politics did not enter the picture. For many of them, they had in fact met the right person. The real Nigeria. None of the women had visited Nigeria before they arrived with their husbands. Many of their families were anxious that they were going to be so far away. Although technology was changing, Africa and the Caribbean did not enjoy the new technology at the same rapid pace as those in North America or Europe. Few families still had telephones. Letters were still the main mode of communication, and it took weeks for letters to arrive. Nonetheless, their stories conveyed that this was an exciting time for them to be going to Nigeria. Their husbands were among that generation sent to England and Canada to acquire degrees that would prepare them to take over the civil service positions, launch new hospitals, new universities, and major infrastructure projects. A number had positions lined up for them even before they arrived in Nigeria. Many of these new brides admitted that they underestimated the difficulty of adjusting to life in Nigeria. Some suggested that it was based on assumptions about Blackness and life below the equator. They assumed that they would have much more in common with Nigerians. After all, they shared rainy season, fresh mangoes and pineapples, and they were all Black. They underestimated as well the cultural differences, particularly around gender and what was expected of good wives versus good husbands. These cultural differences sometimes led to difficult relationships with in-laws. Many chafed at the demands for deference to male and female husbands. And this particularly in Yoruba land, many people know that you marry into your husband's household, his lineage. So both your relationship is sort of defined by your status as a wife, whether to his male or female relatives. They also encountered difficulty with getting jobs, and visa problems were ubiquitous. A foreign wife either had to become a Nigerian citizen or travel as a tourist. Being away from cultural comforts of home and coming to terms with the degree to which they had underestimated the challenges of being a foreign wife and mother put a strong emphasis on creating support groups and networks. Associational life. The West Indian Association of the Shacklefords era had essentially died. So women like Lorraine helped to resurrect it. They had regular meetings, but they also created a sort of economic cooperative. If someone saw breadfruit in season, they would purchase enough to share with others. During marriages or other important social functions, they stood in for those missing maternal lineage members. If there was a death, the others brought food, made contributions, and sometimes moved in to help the grieving person. They also compelled the Jamaican government to open a consulate in Lagos, and Dudley Thompson, later Jamaica's ambassador to Kenya, was the first consul general in Lagos. I had assumed there was only one West Indian Association, the one in Lagos. However, I soon learned that there was one in Ibadan too, the Coterie of Social Workers. Many people spoke longingly of the annual dinner dances the Coterie organized and of the charity work they did. So West Indian associations were not limited actually to Ibadan or Lagos. There were groups in Onitsha, in Aba, and I was told there was a group in Kano. Many women in the West Indian associations also joined Niger Wives. But there were West Indian women who were only in Niger Wives. And Niger Wives came to play a critical role because of the way they organized to address visa issues. They took the Nigerian government to court in order to create a visa category that made it easier for them to travel between Nigeria and their countries of origin. Niger Wives also had established chapters around the country, and at their annual conference, representatives, or as many women who could come from other parts of Nigeria, would attend the conference. So in the midst of being in Nigeria, how did they maintain a West Indian identity? And discussions about West Indian identities reveal the complexity, in fact, of what West Indian means. Like earlier generations of migrants, they found it much easier to be West Indian outside of the region. The attempt at political federation in the Caribbean actually collapsed, leading to Jamaica and Trinidad emerging as independent nations in 1962. When asked to identify the things that marked their West Indian identity, most said food, language, gardens. In the discussion about foods, I was reminded that Bajans don't say rice and peas, it's peas and rice. Similarly, Bajans or Barbadians are not as much into curry goat as Jamaicans. And that was to remind me to think about my title. I was entirely surprised, however, at how many people brought up gardens as a marker of West Indianness. I was regaled with stories of the woman who was said to have the best garden in Ibadan. They said that she had just an incredible array of orchids, in fact, orchids of every color and shade. I would also subsequently come to realize that I knew her son because her daughter-in-law was my colleague at Dartmouth. But these women, they also take credit for transforming Nigerian attitudes towards gardens. One person recalled that Nigerians used to ask her permission to take pictures of themselves in her garden. While the woman with the best garden in Ibadan made a name for herself creating bridal bouquets and wedding cakes. They told me she was flown to different parts of Nigeria to provide these services for couples getting married. Gardens reminded them of home, especially the Caribbean. So they brought back cuttings from Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad of the plant life that populated their front yards or the pots on their parents' verandas. Despite the cost, some of them did their best to send their children to the Caribbean to visit the relatives, because it was important for them that their children understood their West Indian heritage. But as one person explained, we weren't trying to raise West Indian children in Nigeria. This picture, let me just back up here. So this is a garden of someone's house in Ibadan. And she gave me an entire tour of the gardens.
We're not able to see the picture yet, Judy, sorry.
Oh.
You may have to share your screen first.
Oh, dear. Okay, 1 second. I thought it was still set up to share. Okay, share screen.
We can see it now. Thank you.
You can see it? Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so I didn't understand when you had asked the question before. Okay, and you're seeing it now, right?
Absolutely, it's beautiful.
Okay, Good. So yeah, this is my picture of Jamaica. So this is where I said my mother's from Trelawney and my father from here and Anata Bay in St. Mary. Okay. And then Jamski was that restaurant in Lagos and, you know, home of the Jamaican patty. Okay, and this is a garden that one of the women that I interviewed, we did a tour of her garden, and you know she was quite happy that I was taking pictures of it. This is a business run by a nutritionist who grew up in Jamaica and the U.S. and then eventually married and a Nigerian and moved to Nigeria. And she has this, it's out of order a little bit here, but this is part of her garden and it's just extensive. She also has things labeled and some of them are flowers, but some are also medicinal. This is a cafe in Ikoyi, if I'm not mistaken. And I was struck by, of course, these flowers are something that you see all the time in the Caribbean, but he also had this little cactus garden but in the windowsill here. Okay, I'll leave it on this one now. Okay, I call this section Nigerian Cycles. Nigerian history frames the lives of these women. The anticipation of independence gave way to the grinding experience of the Civil War, military governments, and structural adjustment. Some left during the Civil War, but not before experiencing its trauma. One woman told me how she helped her in-laws survive by showing them how to eat boiled green bananas. That was not something that Nigerians in the East tended to eat, but it was something that we eat regularly in the Caribbean. Some suggest that a significant number of women actually left as a result of structural adjustment. Their families were being decimated by the fact that once reliable government positions entrapped them in ever-deepening cycles of indebtedness or impoverishment. The Trinidadian, Canadian, or British passports that brought them to Nigeria to build their families now became tickets out or a lifeline for their Nigerian families. Through their mothers, West Indian Nigerian children can claim dual citizenship and acquire some transnational privileges, such as the relative ease of traveling with a British passport instead of a Nigerian passport. Some women essentially relocated. Lorraine, who was one of those women who did invariably leave Nigeria in the 1990s, was a driving force behind the creation of the West Indian Nigerian group in London. This next section completely floored me, or I had not anticipated the fact that I would have to think about where they are in their life cycles now. Aging in place. Many of the women who shared their stories with me are in their 70s and 80s. I did meet a woman who's in her 90s. They have health issues, but many are vibrant and active. They attend Niger Wives or West Indian Association meetings. They complain about their shrinking numbers as the current generation of foreign wives don't feel the same need for associational life. They identify the internet as one of the main things that allows this generation of foreign wives to stay connected to family and friends back home. In addition, some suggest that many more of this generation of foreign wives are married to men who are wealthy, particularly who are in IT or finance, and also who have the resources to help their wives establish their own businesses. They worry about the future of their organizations, and this worry becomes more acute as they age. Some are now widows. Many of their children live outside of Nigeria, often in the countries where their mothers transitioned on their way to Nigeria. Some don't drive at night anymore. Sometimes they will skip meetings that are too far. They wonder if there will be anyone left in these associations to assist them when they are finally confined to their homes. When I ask if they would consider leaving Nigeria, they ask to go where? Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados is the home of beginnings and nostalgia. Their parents' generation have died. Many of their contemporaries also moved abroad, and those who remained in the Caribbean are also in the same stage of life. They worry about the cost of elder care in the UK or in Jamaica and the burden it may place on their children. They actually say it's cheaper and easier to find or to have care and support in Nigeria. They also worry about the confinement that is a part of living in northern countries. One woman imagined that she would spend several months sitting at a window looking out, while at least in Nigeria, she can sit in her garden all year round. Okay, my takeaways. These women are inspiring, they're adventurous, fun-loving, and determined. Some of them achieved tremendous success as they redrew the transatlantic triangle that was forged during the era of the slave trade. Their triangle emerged out of an anticipation that they would satisfy their professional and personal aspirations on the continent where the African diaspora began. Even though they did not cite politics with influence in their decision, decolonization in the Caribbean and Africa ignited this anticipation of a future that would not be defined by the economic, racial, and cultural violence that underwrote life under colonialism. While there are many successes in the lives of these women, we should not apply the triumphalist glow of globalization to the narrative of the global family. African diasporic global families are also the creation of interlocking structures of inequality that restrict the ability of an increasing number of people to be citizens of one nation. These women fled the limited opportunities of the West Indies, contended with bone-chilling temperatures and racism while they gained their degrees and settled in Nigeria. Yet now in the 21st century, their children are rebuilding the triangle that was forged during the era of the slave trade as they seek to satisfy their personal and professional aspirations. Thank you, and I really look forward to your suggestions and questions.
Thank you for that very engaging talk, Judy. Very fascinating, and we look forward to hearing what many of you think. We are now officially moving to the Q&A. We have about 14 minutes, and we invite everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A box, which can usually be found in the bottom right corner of your screen. You may submit your questions there, and there's also a little blue man. I think you can raise his hand and we can see hands being raised. So Judy, the first question that we have, I don't know if you can see the Q&A box on your end, asking, did these elderly West Indian women get support and care from their religious networks, such as churches and other Christian NGOs?
Actually, yes. Many of them are actually very involved in their churches as well. And so people will visit them after services if they're unable to go. But a number of the ones I spoke to were still, active enough that they were able to go to church. And in fact, in the Niger Wives branch in Lagos, they have formed a care committee And so these are still elderly women, but they are still able to be active. And so they take turns visiting members who have, going through illnesses, have been in the hospital or something, or just constantly checking on them. So yeah, the networks do extend beyond just those specific organizations. And depending as well on the sort of relationships that they did forge with their in-laws, some of them are quite close to their in-laws. In fact, there was one woman I interviewed who, her husband actually died in 1979, but she decided to raise the kids in Nigeria, and she wanted them to be Nigerian. But she said that was possible because she had such a good relationship with her mother-in-law. And in fact, as her mother-in-law got more elderly and was unable to take care of herself, she actually took care of her till the end.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There are several more questions. So one from Vanessa asking, did you speak to any younger Niger wives?
Yes, I did. And their stories are really interesting. So there are a couple of younger Niger wives who are moving into sort of positions, executive offices within Niger wives. And they were very open about a couple of issues that for them, sometimes they felt the more senior women didn't quite appreciate. One is that some of them do have young children. And so, coming to the meetings may be one thing, but organizing different activities, and they do a lot of charity work. Nigerwise in particular contributes to the Braille Association, or developing reader material in Braille for the blind. And they used to hold different sort of, rummage sales and different things like that. But some of the younger women will say, this is difficult when you have young children, and they're also working as well. But there is this lament sometimes as well that, the senior women will make about, the younger women not wanting to be involved. And a couple of the younger women I interviewed said, well, one of the issues is that they won't let us do stuff. They tell us, okay, we want this done, and we try to do it our way. And they say, no, that's not how we've done it. We've always done it this way. and so that does create some of the tensions there too. But in fact, I did also interview some younger women, as well as women from even a South African woman as well too, and a woman who's from Haiti. So just to give myself a fuller range of experiences, even though this project is primarily on this older generation of women.
Really fascinating. So brace yourself for the next one. It is about divorce. And the person asked, Judith spoke extensively about marriage. That's great. What does she have to say about divorce? Were there cases of divorce among Nigerian and their Black diaspora spouses? How were such cases of divorce handled? Take it away, Judy.
Yeah. There were cases of divorce. And one of the issues that created a bump in many marriages, and then ultimately sometime led to divorce, was the second wife. And I was being euphemistic when I said, there's this difference in expectations about the good wife versus the good husband. And the women who tended to divorce were the women who decided that they could not accommodate having, being part of basically a polygamous marriage and a polygynous marriage. And so, this is one of the areas where the visa issue really became a problem, because sometimes, or there was a time when you had to have your husband's approval to come back into the country. And if there were tensions in a marriage, sometimes the wife would travel, and the husband would not approve for her coming back into the country. And so I think many of these women, or some of the women I interviewed at any rate, really made a conscious decision as to how they were going to deal with, second wives, or just in general being expected to take care of the children by themselves with sort of very little assistance. Some who divorced left Nigeria, but some who divorced decided to stay in Nigeria. And those who stayed in Nigeria were the ones who were at a certain professional level where they could support themselves. So there was one woman I interviewed who was divorced, but she was a lawyer, and she had actually started her own firm. And so she was quite capable of taking care of her children on her own. And there was a certain pride in that, because I think the family had expected that once the marriage broke apart, then, she would leave. She would have no choice but to leave. But her attitude was, I'm here, the kids are here, and I'm going to raise them here.
Really interesting. So the next question has to do with contributions to language. And the question is, Dr. Byfield, there are claims that Jamaican patois has borrowed from Nigerian languages such as Yoruba and Igbo. Do you think these Jamaican sisters played a role in this linguistic borrowing?
It's so interesting. So one of the things I think in terms of the research in the Caribbean, we have, the convention has been that most people in Jamaica actually came from Akan-speaking areas. And, they were sort of labeled Coromantee. And it's only fairly recently that people are recognizing that actually there were a number of Igbo speakers who were brought to Jamaica as well. And so there is, linguists are trying to figure out as much as they can, or to the extent that they can right now, the origins of some of these words that make up patois. One of the things I can say, and actually also from my own experience, that there's enough of a relationship between Jamaican patois and Pidgin so that I actually was able to understand a lot more Pidgin than I expected to. But one of the other things that I think connects or contributes to the spread of Jamaican patois, I think we can't separate it from the music and sort of the particularly with the rise of reggae, because one of the things about reggae is that they do use patois in the lyrics of these songs. Sorry, it was one of the things that certainly the Jamaican upper class didn't like about reggae. But as that music really spread, I think that popularized Jamaican patois within the continent. One of the complaints I heard from the women, they said, everybody assumes if you're West Indian, you're Jamaican. And I had to keep telling them, we are not all Jamaican.
Thank you. The next one is by a professor here at Keisha Lindsay. Thanks for a great talk. As a faculty member here at UW and as a fellow Jamaican married to a Ghanaian, I am wondering if anyone is doing similar research on Caribbean women living in Ghana and married to Ghanaian men. During my time in Ghana, I was struck by the diverse background of these women. Some are Rasta, others work with international organizations, others met their spouses in the UK. And I will piggyback on that question and throw Cameroon in that mix. I have a sign here saying greetings from Cameroon, so we are in the room too.
Um, in fact, I don't know of anyone doing similar work on Ghana or Cameroon. And that is actually, in the proposal that I wrote, one of the things that I pointed out is that so much of the work that's done on the African diaspora in Africa actually focuses on African Americans. And so, you know, Kevin Gaines has that book about African Americans in Ghana. Seth Markle has a book about African Americans in Tanzania. But this is where West Indians sort of fall under the radar. And so, you know, the people who tend to look at West Indian migration are looking at it usually just in terms of North America and Europe. And really very, very few. I've only encountered one other person. And actually someone told her about my project and she got in touch with me. And she's a geographer at Brown University. And she is one of these children of a Nigerian father and a West Indian mother. And she's the only other one that I'm aware of who's doing this sort of work. And so we had this wonderful exchange about gardens, because I was like, I had no idea where that came from. And so as a geographer, that's one of the things that she's going to be talking about too. And particularly her project is looking at the houses, how they construct the houses, how they furnish the houses, and the elements of sort of Caribbean practices around the home are brought to Nigeria. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know of a lot of people doing that. And I think that actually would be a really important, I would love to see people doing this, looking at West Indian communities in other places. A lot of Jamaicans were actually brought to Cameroons to work on plantations. Mm-hmm. And I remember coming across those files in the archives, but I don't know if anyone has actually done any work on that.
Yeah, they pop up in the archives for me in the 1960s. So they are definitely there. The next one is connected to sort of the everyday. You were talking about how they furnish their homes. And so the next question is about, I recall you mentioned use of Aso Ebi at functions, but in their day-to-day mode of dressing, did these women adopt Nigerian mode of dressing?
I think there were certain times when they did. So when they socialized, they would very often wear Nigerian dress. I think at work, and because a number of them were nurses, and I forgot to mention that too, I was really surprised at how many of them were nurses. So for work, they wore Western dress, or they had uniforms. But I think very often it was more at home and then social life where they would wear this. Not the ones I interviewed, very few of them actually spoke either Yoruba or Igbo. But there was one woman who was a very fluent Yoruba speaker and actually she was the first non-Nigerian perm sec since independence. And there was some tension about the fact, because she was given this position under Governor Tinubu. And there was some debate about the fact that she wasn't Nigerian, but Tinubu was actually able to use it to his advantage by saying, Lagos is a cosmopolitan place. Mm-hmm. We have to be open to having people from, different backgrounds in positions of authority. So it was really interesting to hear how she was able to navigate that particular period. But I think part of what helped actually was the fact that she was also fluent in Yoruba.
Mm. Thank you. So we're going to take a quick pause here. I'm going to let everyone know that it is now 1 o'clock, so Africa at noon is officially over, but we're still going to be here because there are lots of fascinating more questions. And so hopefully we'll be able to go through several more of these questions. But before some of you left, we just wanted to say thank you for being here with us today. For those of you who are still here, thank you for staying on and engaging with us with the following questions. So the next one is you mentioned Kano as another area where West Indian women lived. How many were Muslims, and were any involved in polygamous relationships? And if so, what were their experiences?
Okay, so that I have no idea about at this point. I really had confined myself this trip to just the West. So, Ogun State, Lagos, and Oyo. A number of women did encourage me, though, to move around and try to find some of these other West Indian groups. And one of the things that I was interested in, I did learn about a West Indian man who is married and to a Nigerian woman and lives in Kano. But I don't have any information on that. It will have to be these networks, that will hopefully be able to connect me to people who are in these other places. The one thing, though, that one of the women I interviewed this summer lives in Onitsha, and she was on Zoom. We were able to do it on Zoom. And so I've done a couple more on Zoom as well. So I think once the school year is done and I can sort of focus on something else, that I will try to see how many people I could connect with over Zoom. Because the other thing too, with the pandemic, I was supposed to be in Nigeria this summer, but Fulbright, pulled back the people who were abroad and didn't let anybody travel. The hope is, or they're planning, that people may be able to travel again next summer. But, we just don't know.
Yeah. So this now eases us to the next question. Seems more like a statement when you were talking about networks. And it's hi, Judy, this is Megan. Just wanted to remind you that most of the older Niger wives, West Indians, do have financial independence. And also the Niger Wives Widows Social Group, I believe is being stated as an example. And the next one is, Judith, would you say West Indian wives fared better than European or other categories of foreign wives in Nigeria? Does their African ancestry confer special privileges?
Thanks, Megan, for that. I do. In fact, I'll touch bases with you again about some of those. In terms of whether or not West Indian wives fare better, this actually came up in conversation. And there are a couple of women who, there was some ambivalence expressed. So on one hand, the fact that there were these things that they had in common, and so I mentioned about the mango and the pineapples and rainy season. Those things, in those areas, I think the transition wasn't difficult. But on the other hand, some women suggested to me that the European women may have actually been a little better prepared because they were coming into a situation they knew was and expected to be dramatically different. Whereas some of the West Indians came over, thought that they had this advantage because they were from the West Indies. And so that's why, some said they had underestimated the cultural differences. But that question, though, of sort of the different experiences of women from the African diaspora who marry Nigerian men versus white American and European women who marry Nigerian men, I think is something to be explored. And so I haven't done enough interviews with, you know, white wives of Nigerian men. I've done a few actually. And so it's a question that I'm keeping in mind. I can't really say anything sort of conclusively about it at this time.
So we do have another question that will keep your mind going about the issues of marriage. So Cici said, excellent research, Judith. Any possibilities of remarriage by divorced women who decided to stay?
You know, that's so funny. Actually, I think there was one woman I did interview who had, yes, she had remarried. Her first husband was Igbo and her second husband was Yoruba. And so part of what was interesting about her, though, was that she did decide to stay. And she didn't have children. So I think if she had wanted to leave, that you know, would have been very understandable. But she decided nonetheless that she wanted to stay in Nigeria. And actually this woman was Haitian. And so even though I'm primarily focusing on sort of Anglophone Caribbean women, this was one of those opportunities where she was such an interesting person that I thought I just have to talk to her. So a number of the ones I met who are either divorced or widowed, though, didn't seem to want to remarry. So I'm not sure what accounts for the decision not to remarry. It may have, you know, something to do with some of the expectations around marriage. You know, they got comfortable living by themselves, and so, you know, wanted to limit family drama.
They had independence, autonomy.
Yeah.
So the next question is, oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, I was just saying they were okay.
Yeah. So the next question is about the archives. So Emily Songola asked, have you looked in archives of religious institutions about the lives of Jamaican women or wives in Africa? There have been Caribbean women in these spaces that may have left narratives about their lives. So I'm assuming memoirs, biographies, autobiographies, and so on.
Yeah, no, I haven't looked in any of the church archives as yet. And that is actually something that I do plan to do, given that some of these families, particularly like the Ricketts family, came end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, were missionaries. And so that I think will require not just looking at church archives, but maybe even trying to identify some of their descendants now, whether they're still in Nigeria or maybe back in the region or in the US or the UK. But yeah, I definitely, as I said, this is still the beginning. And so I still have many more archives to explore, as well as many more interviews to do.
Thank you. So we're almost at the end there. So the next one is by Somatan, and she says, thank you for this fantastic presentation, Professor Byfield. Can you discuss the intimate and domestic lives of West Indian women who were part of the first generation before independence? How do they maintain or reformulate West Indians during this period?
Well, for that generation before independence, that is still a bit of a blank for me. And this is one of the things that we've been trying to find sort of newspapers or different sorts of stories that may have been carried about these, these women. I do know, for example, that a number of them were dressmakers as well as bakers. And I think it's, certainly I know that for the Shacklefords that, bacon was at the center of their wealth there. I don't have enough information at this point to be able to say much more about, sort of the interior spaces of their lives. And some of that, I think, is what I'm hoping I can tease out from some of the interviews I hope to do with those members of this earlier generation, descendants of that earlier generation who were there in Lagos. I've heard a couple stories about, again, sort of the social life, how some of the daughters of these families were seen as, great marriage partners, things like that. But at this point, I still don't have enough about that.
Thank you. So we are down to 2 comments. So one is a statement and one is a question. So we'll start with the statement from Chika, who has already left us, but she did say thank you. I understand you worked mainly in southwestern Nigeria, but there was a thriving gardening community in Port Haircut and in northern Nigeria, which influenced people like my mother, who came from a farming family. The addition of flowers was not a stretch to many. I'm most interested in the horticultural aspect of your study. Are you going to do anything more in that area? And we have, I think I'll just combine the last 2 questions. So we have Adwa, who asked, thank you for a great talk. Can you say a little bit more about the relationship between the Niger Wives group with other Nigerian women's organizations, including political groups in the mid-20th century? And Musisi came in with one last question: any autobiographies from these women? And it's all of our questions and statements all rolled into one.
Oh gosh. Okay. So I will be doing more on horticulture, and particularly in terms of thinking about what they planted and if there were, what were the specific ones that they brought back from the region. I knew in the garden of the woman who they said had the best garden in Ibadan, one of the things they pointed out was that she had an ackee tree. And ackee it's a fruit and it's yellow and it grows in this pod. And if it doesn't open on the tree, then it's actually poisonous. And so you have to be very, very careful. And when it opens, it lets out this poisonous gas. But it grows in Nigeria, but it's not something that many Nigerians eat. And so that was partly why I think so many people were excited about the fact that she had this ackee tree. And in Jamaica, it's almost like, our national dish or one of our national dishes. And in fact, Jamski, when he can find, or Emmanuel, who owns Jamski, when he can find ackee, he, buys as much as he can, and he sort of lets the word out that, there's ackee on the menu.
By the way, Chika did want to say that she is here, so I apologize for
okay.
saying that Chika was no longer here.
In terms of Niger Wives, it's really in the 70s that they got going. And I don't know if there were any formal relationships between Niger Wives and Nigerian women's organizations. But I certainly, from conversation, know that a number of them did support the political work that was being done among women in Nigeria. But I don't know if any of those links were institutionalized? And actually, that's a good question for me to ask when I go back over. And then the last one, sorry, there was Niger-wise horticulture.
And the autobiographies.
Oh, yes.
Autobiographies.
So they are actually, Niger-wise is actually starting a project where they want, particularly the older members, to write, memoirs, and they want to put together a volume of these memoirs. Right now, I don't know of anyone who has done an autobiography or had anything published, but Niger-wise is thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have reached the end. Thank you, everyone, for those of you who held on. This was so fun. This was a really fascinating talk. Judy, I learned so much. I want to thank Aaliyah, everyone who sort of helped put this together, Diana, Neil Kardash, and of course, Judy, for being here and sharing so much with us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Bye now.